what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, I mean the settings which I adopted as the test settings in my review. So it allows my colorimeter to hit its usual targets, which I go for in my reviews, and it suits my own preferences and my own unit that I'm testing. Be aware that individual preferences and units vary, so these won't be optimal in all cases. So the first setting to change would be, or to make sure it's correct, would be preset, which I'd recommend setting to user. The others make various adjustments to the image which are undesirable, and they also lock off various settings. So yeah, stick to user for the best experience. I set the brightness to 42. It comes close to the 160 nit target I generally go for in my reviews. And I do that for consistency, but it does suit my preferences and lighting environment as well. Of course, you'll have your own lighting environment and preferences, so just adjust the brightness according to those. Some people might prefer a more toned down look, as the developers intend for sRGB content, in which case you can select Professional Mode's sRGB. And with this, you don't set a preset. You can adjust the brightness according to your own preferences. And you can see, or hopefully can see, that the colour menu is greyed out, so you can't change the colour channels. You are restricted, but this is an sRGB emulation setting. It clamps the gamut closer to sRGB as explored in the review, so if you prefer that representation, it is an option. There's an interesting little quirk with this setting, or there was on my unit anyway. If I went to the sRGB setting and then changed professional mode back to native, it actually gave me sRGB emulation but with all of my controls unlocked. The issue is that it actually does return to the full native gamut if you're not using the sRGB setting once the signal is lost and then regained. So if you turn the monitor off then on again, or it goes into standby or something like that, or it switches refresh rates or resolutions, then it will return to using the full native gamut. So not really a very useful bug, but just something to be aware of. I also like to set color temperature to user. That allows you to adjust the red, green and blue color channels. Changed red to 46, green I left at 50, and blue I set to 45. And with this, I got close to the 6500K white point target I generally go for in my reviews, with a good neutral green channel. These adjustments will not apply to all units. Feel free to use them, but please do make your own adjustments if the image clearly doesn't look how you want. Setting the gamma to off was optimal on my unit. Again, it might not be the case for you, or it might not be suitable for your preferences, but that's how it was with mine. Overdrive, I set that to standard. That was my preference. Depending on the refresh rate range, off, standard or advanced could be potentially useful. The ultra fast setting, really not useful at all. There's also an auto setting, and as I explore in the review, basically what that does is it sets the monitor to advanced when it's above about 80 Hz and standard below that. My preference is to keep it at standard even for higher refresh rates on this monitor, because I found the overshoot a little bit strong using advanced, but that's again my preference. And the other thing in gaming setup, there is a FreeSync/G-Sync setting. If you enable that, you will be enabling adaptive sync, so you can use VRR on the monitor. Doesn't mean you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR, because this monitor doesn't have HDMI 2.1 ports, but it does mean you can use adaptive sync. I noticed something a bit curious when I first activated this setting and then enabled G-Sync in NVIDIA control panel, like I'm doing now. It shifts the entire image so it runs off the screen. You should be able to see that on the video. It's cut off the bottom of my image. It's just displaced everything down so it runs off the bottom of the screen, basically. If that happens, just turn the feature off, then on again in the OSD. Then you can go back to NVIDIA control panel and it should all be enabled for you. I've just turned the FPS counter feature of the monitor on and I can see it is indeed working as I'd expect it to. So to recap, the settings I changed under SDR, I set the preset to user, brightness to 42, made sure professional modes was set to native. Without that I wouldn't have been able to change some of this stuff anyway. I set color temperature to user, red to 46, green to 45, set gamma to off. There's also an HDMI color range option. I'm using DisplayPort, so that's grayed out. If you have that available, I'm not sure exactly what the options are. I can't remember. I wasn't really looking at this when I was using HDMI. But the default setting should be the correct one, and it should be something like full range or 0 to 255 or something like that. You want to be selecting that or keeping that rather than using a limited range signal, unless you're using a system such as a Nintendo Switch that might work better with a limited range signal, or you want to enforce that for some other reason. And last but not least, if you want to use VRR, FreeSync/G-Sync should be set to on, and remember you might have to enable the option in your graphics driver and then disable the option in the OSD, then re-enable the option in the OSD. Now, I don't know if you have to do this on the AMD side. It might happen with FreeSync as well. I don't have an AMD GPU to verify whether it does or doesn't do that. I've now enabled HDR. I'm going to go through this supremely quickly because there's really nothing I would recommend changing under HDR. You can according to your own preferences, but the HDR on this monitor is super basic. You can't adjust things like brightness anymore, contrast. You can change the black equalize setting if you really want to, just according to your own preferences. You can use FreeSync/G-Sync, just keep that on if you were using that. You can use VRR with HDR on the monitor at the same time if you wish. The color temperature setting, that does actually carry over from SDR to HDR, but the good news is that you should find the color balance and the white point pretty similar under HDR and SDR in terms of the color channels. So if you've optimized that for SDR, it should also apply to HDR. And last but not least, I'd like to talk a little bit about the black equalize settings, so visibility enhancement, if you want a competitive edge. Now you won't be able to see on the video exactly what things look like to the eye, but you'll be able to see a relative difference that this setting makes. It's set to 50 by default. Now, something I like about this setting is that you have a lot of control over it because you set it in single unit increments. So 100 is the strongest setting. I know that was hard to see in the video, but I've just increased it to 100, and all of these blocks are very clearly visible now, but it does reduce your contrast as you increase this above 50, so it's dragging up the black point as well, which is unfortunate. I prefer it when these settings don't do that kind of thing, but it does achieve its main thing of increasing the visibility, and you might find you don't need to drag it all the way up to 100. You maybe want to set it to somewhere between 50 and 100, up to you, but remember you're still losing a bit of contrast by doing that. And below 50, you're dragging shades down, darkening them up more, which again you might want to do according to your own preferences. I've set it to 0 to give an extreme example here, but personally I didn't touch this. I like to just keep it at the default of 50. And because this monitor doesn't have very good documentation for it, or not that I could find anyway, not in English, you might be unaware of some of the additional settings which I haven't gone through here. I did find the OSD quite comprehensive for a budget offering, I have to say, and actually it had some settings which you don't always get with more expensive monitors either. So it was nice to see, for example, the gamma setting, which I did go through. There's also a sharpness setting, which is adjusted in increments of 10. You also have 6-axis hue and saturation adjustment, so that's quite nice to see. There's a low blue light slider as well. So you can see a few different settings there, 100 being the strongest effect. It does give a strong greenish yellow tint, which I don't really like, to the image, although that's pretty common with these kind of settings. There isn't an option on this monitor low blue light setting that you can easily activate that is better balanced and gives a nice warm amber tint. There are also some game assist settings, such as an on-screen timer that appears in the top left, counts down there from whatever you selected. There's a crosshair, a few different designs here. You can't customize that. Not sure if you can even see that on the video. Quite small. It's a little red blob in the middle of the screen. Maybe a bit clearer with that particular desktop background. And you can't have that at the same time as the timer on the screen, incidentally. You can only have one of these features active at once. There's also the FPS counter, which I showed you before. And again, you can't have that active at the same time as, for example, the crosshair or the timer. And be aware that this is showing the refresh rate of the monitor, so if you're not using VRR, then it will just stick to whatever the static refresh rate of the monitor is. You can also customize the look of the OSD a little bit, the color scheme used. The default Cypress green. There's also glow orange, crystal blue, and begonia red, which is really more pink to purple than red. But if you like that kind of thing, feel free to use that color scheme.